bringing you that breaking news that President Joe Biden has withdrawn from the election race. Just in the last 10 minutes or so, we have had that news from Joe Biden, who, of course, had been facing increasing pressure to pull out of his bid for another term in the White House ever since his disastrous debate against his rival Donald Trump. In the last few minutes, he has released a statement. My fellow Americans, it reads, over the past 3.5 years, we've made great progress as a nation. He says America has the strongest economy in the world. We've made historic investments in rebuilding our nation, in lowering prescription drug costs, expanding affordable health care. He continues with a long list of his achievements in power, past the most significant climate legislation in the history of the world. America has never been better positioned to lead than we are today. Joe Biden continues that none of this could have been done without the American people. He goes on to say that it has been the greatest honor of his life to serve as your president. While it has been my intention to seek re-election, he says, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term. I will speak to the nation later this week, he writes, in more detail about my decision. And the president continues that he wants to express his deepest gratitude to all those who've worked so hard to get him re-elected. I want to thank Vice President Kamala Harris for being an extraordinary partner in all this work. And let me express my heartfelt appreciation to the American people for the faith and trust they have placed in him. I believe today what I always have, he writes. There is nothing America can't do when we do it together. We just have to remember we are the United States of America. That is the latest statement from Joe Biden, who, of course, has been isolating over the weekend as he recovers from COVID. Let's speak to David Cay Johnston, investigative journalist, author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America and the Making of Donald Trump. David, good evening to you.
Well, hello, Carol. Good to be with you.
Well, tell us your reaction to what we're hearing from the president.
Well, I'm not especially surprised about this. Life is unfair. Joe Biden has done an extraordinary job as president. Among other things, there have been more jobs created in the last 3.5 years than under every Republican president since World War II. And the U.S. economy is absolutely the strongest in the world. But Joe Biden has not been successful in getting people to know that. In fact, a survey by The Guardian found that 60% of Americans believe the U.S. is in a recession, which is absurd, but it also is reflective of how very large segment of the American public does not listen to reliable news organizations and instead puts its trust in organizations that have well-established track records for making things up or distorting the facts. And Biden himself is a man utterly without charisma, unlike Donald. So, and finally, a number of candidates around the country for state offices, for Congress, for the U.S. Senate, have polling showing that he is dragging them down. So, not surprised that Biden has decided to step aside, although for him, I'm sure this is horribly painful given his performance. It also means that his record in history will be the best economic performance of any U.S. president since FDR.
He clearly wanted to stay in the race, even
Yes.
amidst those growing calls from senior Democrats for him to pull out. What do you think it will have been that made him face up to this pressure and to decide that it was the best thing, as he says in that statement, for him to do to actually withdraw?
Well, almost certainly his wife, Jill, told him, sweetheart, you got to do this. She has, he married her after his wife was killed in 1973 in a car crash along with one of their children. And she was a terrific stepmother and has been very, like most wives of presidents, Donald Trump is an exception, but most wives of presidents have a lot of influence over their husbands. Nancy Reagan, for example, exerted a great deal of influence over her husband. And she has to be a key player in this and saying that the evidence is that you're going to take the party down. It's not fair, Joe, but life isn't fair.
And clearly, it seems as though it was that debate against Donald Trump. I mean, I watched that, and it was pretty excruciating. As time and again, Joe Biden appeared to lose his way, even in his closing statement, which presumably he would have rehearsed. Do you think that was, if you like, the beginning of the end of his bid for another term?
Oh, that was absolutely crucial to this. And I would fault his staff, his communication staff, both the White House and the campaign. They should have told Biden, and you should tell anybody who's doing this, you're going to lie down and take a nap this afternoon before you go. And they didn't do that. He was running at full speed, and he ran out of gas that day. The next day, he was live on TV for 2 hours from North Carolina, and he was sharp as a tack. But the damage had been done by this. And Carol, I would deeply fault his communication staff. I have been calling White Houses all the way back to Richard Nixon. This White House is contemptuous of the press. Like the Obama White House, if they don't like your question, they just won't talk to you. At least they don't hang up on you like the Obama people did. And for example, Peter Baker, the New York Times chief White House correspondent, he's a serious student of the presidency. Biden has refused to give him an interview. Well, surprise, surprise, when Biden got in trouble, Peter Baker's articles in the paper and appearances on TV damned with faint praise. He didn't say anything he could say he's biased against him or anything else, but the language that he used was completely low key, and that's their own fault for this, the way they've treated the press. It shouldn't be that way. Reporters should not react based on being mistreated. But in the 2000 election, we saw that George W. Bush, this is in a documentary by Nancy Pelosi's daughter, a filmmaker. There's matching scenes where George W. Bush walks into the campaign plane and says to the reporters, "Hey, Carol, how's that granddaughter of yours doing? And are you still having your cousin getting married to that prince?" And then you
Yeah,
see Al
fascinating. And
Gore.
Nancy Pelosi, of course, has now been one of the key figures who's been urging Joe Biden to stand aside.
Well, I think she's taken a more nuanced role than that. But let me finish this. Al Gore walks to the back of the plane and goes, "The staff says I have to talk to you people. What do you want to know?" And surprise, surprise, guess who got really good coverage? And it wasn't Al Gore. Nancy Pelosi has tried to be pretty clear that she wants Joe to make the decision. It shouldn't be made for him, but he should think carefully about the welfare of the party. I mean, I think they were sort of sophisticated signals, Joe, in public. Joe, you got to go and you got to come to the resolution of this.
Of course, this comes as Donald Trump has survived that assassination attempt. He appeared at his first rally with his new vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance. He has seen a surge in support since he survived that attack, and of course, his defiant gestures afterwards. Do you think it was that growing support for Donald Trump which made Joe Biden realize that perhaps he's not going to be the one that could potentially beat him?
Well, I think Biden was in deep trouble before this happened. Donald, however, a master showman and entertainer, knows how to get benefits out of things. So, according to Eric Trump, his father didn't require a single stitch, and yet he has this enormous bandage on his head. I just had ear surgery that required 9 stitches. You can't tell it's there, even though it was a week ago. Um, and he didn't require any stitches. I think this bump, this in the polls, is not permanent. Every time there's a convention, the candidate gets a bump in the polls. This event clearly would draw some sympathy for Donald, but the stakes here are quite high. I mean, Donald has repeatedly said in hardly coded language. If I don't win, it's the end of America, which is pretty clear for we're going to try and overthrow the government again, like he tried to do 3.5 years ago. Now, the question for the Democrats is, are you going to be smart and unified and immediately put forth, presumably, Kamala Harris, the vice presidential candidate, who's well equipped to go after Donald Trump in visceral language like Donald uses? Or are you going to pick a couple of governors or senators nobody ever heard of who isn't a political wonk and get massacred?
So, do you think that Kamala Harris, with a vice presidential running mate, we don't know who that's going to be yet? There have been a lot of talk, hasn't there, of somebody like Gretchen Whitmer maybe joining her on the joint ticket. Do you think that could be a bigger challenge to Donald Trump now, and that could just change this entire presidential race? Well, clearly it will change the presidential race, but do you think it could change Donald Trump's prospects in this presidential race?
Absolutely. This is very bad news for Donald Trump. Kamala Harris knows how to talk to people on a level they understand, unlike the Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden convoluted, wonky language. They need to have a candidate who will help as vice president. I would guess Josh Shapiro, the popular governor of Pennsylvania, one of the key states. And the Democrats have to focus on the 7, or by some estimates, 13 states that could go either way. They shouldn't spend any time in California and Massachusetts, just as Trump shouldn't spend any time in Louisiana or Mississippi, because we know the results there. And they need to have a ground game. Get people registered. On election day, make sure that they're driven to the polls. If they won't drive themselves, call them, have a big campaign, and have a lot of lawyers, because there is a serious effort that's been written a lot about in America by the Trump people to block people from voting. We've seen this in the past. The Republicans, in fact, for 50 years or so, were under a court order not to do certain things to discourage voting by black people and other minorities. And so if the polling on the issues doesn't especially help Trump, and the biggest issue that can turn out the vote is the U.S. Supreme Court's recent Dobbs decision that took away the right to an abortion, and the promises made by people who are Trump's surrogates, he's trying to soft pedal this, that the state should decide your reproductive future. In fact, this Project 2025 that Donald says, I don't know anything about it, and then he says, but there are parts of it I like and parts of it I don't like. It would prohibit the distribution of contraceptives,
Okay.
condoms, etc.
We'll have to leave it there. David Cay Johnston, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your insight and your thoughts tonight.
Take care, Carol.
Let me just bring you an update on our breaking news tonight. Joe Biden has now said that he is offering his full support and endorsement for Kamala Harris, his vice president. In his latest post on Twitter, he says, "My fellow Democrats, I've decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this." That is the latest post just in the last minute or so from Joe Biden after he decided to pull out of the presidential race. We'll have more reaction to that in just a moment here on Times Radio.